Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Bread Books in the Bible. I'm your host, Virginia Jones, and I just want to say how thankful I am that everyone listens to my podcast. It has been a crazy couple of months. My youngest daughter got married last month, so it was really kind of upsy-turvy, kind of. It's just crazy, topsy-turvy, however you want to say it. And then this month is my in-laws' 60th wedding anniversary. So things have been crazy with that, trying to get that planned and everything. So I do apologize with the craziness of my podcast. Everything has been kind of upside down. And it has been a real learning curve for me. I need to be more prepared when I know that something is coming in the future. So it's crazy. If you hear dogs in the background clumping around on the floor, it is super hot here. Yesterday was 95 degrees, and I am in Maine, and it is supposed to be just as hot today. So I have the AC going in the other room with my door open. And my dogs are coming in and out because they're really hot. I have an Australian Shepherd who does not do well with the heat at all. It's absolutely insane. So I'm continuing today with the podcast series, The Quiet Power of the Pen. And I had wanted to do this series because there are so many people in history that through the correspondence of letters, whether it be to family members, politicians, the public, it doesn't matter. They changed history with their knowledge using correspondence of letters. So in the previous two episodes, and I don't number my episodes, maybe I should number them. I haven't numbered them though, but in the two previous episodes, I had Abigail Adams and Rosa Parks. So if you go to Apple Podcasts, you find Bread Books in the Bible, you can scroll down through there and find those two episodes. But Abigail Adams was the first lady of, I'm sorry, not the first lady. Sorry about that. She was the wife of John Adams. She was not the first lady, the sitting lady. But she was the president of John Adams, and she made quite an impression. She advised her husband, and she did so many more things. So I'm not going to tell you everything. But Rosa Parks also made an impression through letter writing, through taking a stand against segregation, and she was a really important figure. I found out some things, though, that I felt were a little odd in that episode. So if you go to the episode about Rosa Parks, you'll find out why I felt some things were a little strange. So in today's episode, I am talking about Florence Nightingale. So she was born May 12th, 1820. And she was very influential in reforming nursing in England. And then she established through other people that she had trained nursing in the United States. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more. But she was born May 20th, 1820, in Florence, Tuscany, hence her name. Her parents would name their children wherever they were born. And so she had a sister, which I did not write her name down because I could not pronounce the name. I had no idea how, and I should have looked up the pronunciation, but it was like, yeah, I'm not going to try that one. But anyway. So she moved back to England though in 1821. So her father must have had jobs in the area of France, and she ended up moving back to England in 1821. Her parents were William Edward Shore and Frances Nightingale. Now, I found it odd, and some women do this, I guess. They take, or the husband takes on their wife's last name, which is kind of weird to me. I'm old-fashioned. I just feel like the wife should take the name of her husband. But anyway, so the the gentleman ended up taking the last name of his wife. And it happened to be that William was kin, or he had a friend who was kin to William Wilberforce, who was the abolitionist in England who fought against slavery. And I'm going to get into a future episode of that because right now we have, I believe it's the state of New York. We have, and I know this is kind of a side thing, but right now in New York, there are Black people who are asking for reparations for their ancestors being in slavery. And I find that very concerning because we don't have slavery in this nation as far as Black people being in slavery. That is not happening in this country. And most of the people asking for that didn't have ancestors, or if they did, they might have been saved by abolitionists. So, and they don't come into the understanding that a lot of the abolitionists were white, and there were Black slave owners back then who took their own people and sold them into slavery. So I want to get into an episode about that because the people that are asking for these reparations actually don't even know their own history. So it's crazy. Okay, back to the episode though. So the grandfather was friends with William Wilberforce. So I believe it was Francis's grandfather, I think is what it was, that was friends with William Wilberforce, who was an abolitionist in England who ended up fighting to end slavery. And if you've ever seen the movie Amazing Grace, it's awesome. If you have not, I highly recommend that movie that goes through and explains everything that happened during that time and how William Wilberforce, through his abolitionist theories, was able to end slavery in England. Awesome movie. Okay, so going on. So during that time in England, it was the Victorian era. Many women during that time were wed to men who, they had reasons for political or financial gain. Um, and they believed their role was to be a wife and a mother, which I absolutely have no problem whatsoever with. But during that time, women's minds were not considered very sharp. Women were not considered to be of any use except to be a wife and a mother. They were not regarded as anything but sometimes as good as a cow being sold. Okay. And that's unfortunately in many parts of our history, that is the way it was. And that is not how Francis's father saw his daughters. So his daughters were very educated women. Frances, however, was the more academic one than her sister. And so her father ended up educating them in history, mathematics, Italian, classical literature, and philosophy. So he took it upon himself to basically homeschool his daughters and to educate them because he saw the sharpness of their minds and realized that even though the trends back then were not in a way of educating women and of making sure that they had a good education, they were more to, like I said, where women were considered nothing more sometimes than a cow being traded, or whatever, or being sold. And it's a shame that there was that viewpoint because there were a lot of women back then who had very sharp minds, who thankfully some of them were able to change history. And so Frances was one of those women, thankfully, as we're going to get into. So in 1837, in February, she was called to serve others through the field of nursing. So she really wanted to be in a place where she could help other people. She saw the detriment around her. She saw the poor class of society, and she was more, I think, of an aristocratic family. She was well-to-do. Her father was able to fund her nursing career and everything. Her mother and her sister, though, were not really for her going into nursing. They didn't feel like that was her place to step into society and to take on something like that because, again, they had that mindset that women were better at home, being pregnant, married to, aristocrat through political or financial means, whatever. They didn't have any other use besides being a wife and a mom. However, thankfully, Frances saw the difference, and her father did as well. So she felt like this was a calling of God to be able to go into nursing to help not only those who were in the aristocratic society, but to help those in the lower class as well. She probably walked the streets and saw the detriment that was all around her, the filth and the lack of care. And we're going to get into more of that as we go along as well. So again, her mother and her sister weren't really for this. And her mother had the idea, because of the trends of the day, that women were inferior to men. I don't believe that, and this is a side note here, I personally don't believe that men and women should be in competition. I don't believe that women are better than men. I don't believe that men are better than women. I believe, as I feel the Word of God states, that women and men have different roles. The husband is the head of the family. That I absolutely do believe. I don't believe that a woman is inferior to the man, is of less worth than the man. I believe they both have their own roles, and I want to do an episode on that as well, because we have this rise, and we've had it in years past as well, where men are now staying home and women are pursuing careers, and men and women are getting married, not having children, or not getting married at all. They don't believe in bringing children into society. It's like our whole world has been turned upside down, right? So I definitely want to do an episode on what is the role of the woman in the marriage? What is the role of a woman in society? It is not to be inferior. It is not to be thought less of. It is not necessarily, if God has called you to be single, then by all means stay single. Not every woman in society is called to be married. Not every woman in society finds a husband. But it doesn't mean she's of less worth if she doesn't find a husband, or of less worth if she is married and chooses to be home with her children. So anyway, that's a side note. So, but during that Victorian era, that was the mindset that women were worth only getting, being married, having children, bringing children into society, and their minds weren't useful, weren't needed, their advice wasn't needed, whatever. Her father disagreed with that, thankfully, in this case. So she did try to be in a relationship. She had a courtship that lasted for 9 years with a politician and poet, Richard Monckton Milnes. So she was in a relationship, but she ended that 9-year courtship realizing, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with her viewpoint in this case, but she had in her mind that her being married, it would have hindered her as a nurse. My husband is absolutely for me being a podcaster. He is for me being a photographer. He is for me being a homesteader. We are a team. My husband and I, he is the head of my family. Okay, he's my head, right? Okay, in the spiritual sense, he's my head. He's my provider, my protector, all of that. But he doesn't keep me home locked in a cage where I have no usefulness because now our children are out of the home, so now I'm no longer useful. And even when we had children, I worked, I did house cleaning, um, I did some photography. So a husband and wife should be a team. And in the case of Florence Nightingale, if her husband was all for her being in nursing, I think marriage would have been an addition to her, not a, what do I want to say? Not a liability, right? It would have been a plus for her. However, she felt in her mind that being married, having children, would have put a strain on her nursing. And in some ways, she might have been correct, but in some ways, she might not have been. However, we'll leave that be. So, as she's ending her courtship and she's beginning the role of starting on the road of nursing, she meets a lady by the name of Mary Clark, who was an English-born Parisian hostess who believed that women were equal to men. They had usefulness in the society. They were able to be of service and of usefulness. And even though being different genders, they had different roles, they had different abilities, they had different things that they could do, and men and women were equal. They should be equal. Okay, I'm not under my husband's foot. In the Bible, when God created Adam and Eve, the Lord took the rib from Adam's side. Women are to stand beside men, but both having different roles, right? So men and women, I believe, are equal. And so did Mary Clark. And even though they were decades difference in age, um, they were really good friends. And so she was able to kind of mentor Frances, and she was able to encourage her in her role of being a nurse. So in 1847, Frances met politician Sidney Herbert, and they became lifelong friends. He was the Secretary of War from 1845 to 1846, and then during the Crimean War, he was also the Secretary of War in 1853 to 1856. He was instrumental in grounding Nightingale's nurse work in Crimea. So he was kind of like her backbone, her funding, her encouragement in her working in nursing during the Crimean War. In 1861, he died from Bright's disease, and I wanted to look this up because before nursing, a lot of people would go by I don't know what to call it, like folklore and things like that, and they would diagnose different diseases in different ways that most of the time killed the patient instead of helping the patient. For example, George Washington, our first president, he ended up being in office for, quite a few years, and then he ended up retiring and going back to his home, and he went out one day to check his land and everything, came home, came down with pneumonia, and they would use leeches to cleanse the blood or something like that. Well, in them doing so, they ended up contributing to his death instead of helping him. So many times, people back during that time period had a lot of superstitions. That was the word I was looking for. Had a lot of superstitions, had a lot of folklore, had a lot of herbal remedies, which I'm not against, by the way, but you do need to use herbal remedies in a correct way. And so I looked up Bright's disease. It's actually a kidney disease. It attacks the kidneys, it attacks the heart. It ends up somehow doing damage to the kidneys, and that's what he ended up dying of. But because Nightingale had started on this nursing journey, and she was bringing in more reformed methods of doing things, more modern way of doing things, she was actually accused of killing him. And her methods came against what was already there, right? And so because of it, people accused her of actually killing him. So later on, she ended up going to Egypt, and she was called of God to do good for him alone without reputation. So she wasn't out there making a name for herself, so to speak. She ended up realizing that in this case, her being married, having children, raising a family would somehow interfere with her on her nursing journey. And so she ended up not wanting to do that. So while she was in Egypt, she felt like there was a calling of God to go forward in service to people, not just to people of reputation or people who had money, but she saw the detriment that was in her own country. She saw people around her who, through, I think, misdiagnosis, misunderstanding of the diseases of that day, and lack of knowledge, they ended up doing more damage than good. And she felt like she really wanted to start to change the way people thought about nursing. So in 1850, she visited a Lutheran religious community in Germany where she observed a pastor and deaconess working for the sick and deprived. And through their work, through her observation, she had a life-changing experience. She realized this is really what I want to do. This is exactly what God is calling me to do. He's calling me to help. He's calling me to serve. He's calling me to reach out to those who are deprived, who are less fortunate in the world, to be able to help them to be successful in health and different things. And so in 1851, she published a work called The Institution of Kaiserwerth on the Rhine for the practical training of deaconesses. So she took what she had learned, she took what she was observing, and she put it into a published form. And a lot of women authors would publish anonymously, and so that's what she did in this case. She ended up publishing, trying to get the words out, publishing anonymously so that she could get her work out to the public. And she was able to make that available. So this was kind of like maybe the cornerstone of her beginning to build something for the nursing community. So on August 22nd, 1853, she took the post of superintendent at the Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in London until 1854. So this gave her an opportunity to begin to use her knowledge, use what she had observed to teach other women about being nurses. And on October 21st, 1854, Florence volunteered along with 38 nurses and 15 nuns in the Ottoman Empire, and that was during the Crimean War. So they were about 295 nautical miles from British camp, and forgive me for mispronouncing this, but Balaclava in Crimea, and forgive me if I've mispronounced that name. But they took a post in the Ottoman Empire, and they began to do their work of nursing. She had other people that she had brought with her, 38 other nurses and 15 nuns that were able to begin their first work as nurses, and through their training, they were able to help the soldiers. So during that time, as we've seen throughout history in many wars, we see it in the Civil War, we see it in World War I and World War II, Vietnam, Iraqi War. There were horrible conditions, and they were dealing with a lot of soldiers who had been wounded during the Crimean War, who 9 times out of 10 would die from the diseases that they gained instead of the wounds that they had acquired during the war. And we see that a lot. And I actually want to do a series on the Civil War and how that absolutely, and I'm going to write myself a note on some of these things because I forget. Excuse me. But many times they would die from the disease rather than the wounds that they acquired during war, right? During the Civil War, like I mentioned, World War One, World War Two, different things. It was no different in the Crimean War that they were doing. So during their first winter, 10 times more soldiers died from disease than from battle wounds. Now, I don't know the percentage in the Civil War. I want to be able to look that up. And in the other wars that we have fought, I want to be able to look up that information and be able to present that to you. So these are some of the reasons, and we see that even in our society, we are seeing this. During COVID, we saw this. During other epidemics in our history, we have seen this. These are reasons why nursing needed to be reformed. Overworked staff, there was overcrowding in hospitals. During that time, there was defective sewers, so the ventilation, the sanitary environment of that time period was terrible, and the lack of ventilation. They didn't have the air quality. There wasn't any fresh air. Many times for some diseases, I'm not saying all of them, but for some ailments, getting fresh air is a good thing for us. And many times, they would take patients and they would just sit them outside getting fresh air. They didn't have that in this situation. And so she saw all these things going on and she put her words into action and she was determined to change the direction that nursing was going in. So the Crimean War, when you're taking history in high school and you have these little snapshots, right, of history and all these dates and these names, and then you graduate high school and you forget, right? You don't really dive into things. I'm a history nut. I love to learn about history and things like that, but I don't know everything. And so I wanted to figure out what in the world was the Crimean War even about. So I looked it up, gathered a little bit of information on it. So it was basically between Russia and an alliance of the Ottoman Empire, France, the UK, and Sardinia, which was part of the Spanish Empire back then. And it was over geopolitical reasons that they had this war. I'm sure money played in there somewhere, maybe religion. Many times wars are started because of politics and religion, right? So in this case, it was a political reason that they started. And it was the expansion of Russia, maintaining the balance in the power of Europe. So they were trying to maintain balance of their power, and Russia was expanding, wanting more land, wanting more power, wanting more influence. And we see that in the Ukraine, right? They're trying to take over, Russia's trying to take over Ukraine right now, and they want that because they want more power, more land, more resources. Nothing's ever changed, right? Nothing's changed. So one of the terms, and I've heard this term before about her, one of the terms that Florence Nightingale acquired was called Lady of the Lamp. And the reason why she was called that is because when she was doing her nursing, she had a heart, a compassionate heart for people who were in need, for people who were suffering, who were dying from diseases, who were dying from the lack of knowledge of nursing and things like that, of taking care of themselves. And so as she was taking care of these soldiers, many times at night she would go around and she would check on her patients and she would carry a lantern. And so when she would walk up to a patient, it was almost like that ray of hope for them that, I have hope. I have some ray of light here that I'm going to get better, right? And so she would walk around to her different patients and stuff, and she would have that lantern. And so she acquired the name of Lady of the Lamp, or the title, I guess you would say. So on November 29th, 1855, the Nightingale Fund was established for training nurses. So there was a fund that was created, and I apologize, I don't know if she actually started this fund because her father did give her, and I do have it somewhere in here, and maybe I skipped over it. I might have skipped over it, and I apologize for that. Um, I don't know. I thought I had written it down. Oh, yes, I did have it written down. So her father gave her 500 pounds per year for her nursing. So he funded a lot of her beginning nursing training. So I'm not sure if he was the contributor to the fund or if she took her money and did this fund herself. So I apologize, I didn't really get the clearness on that one. In 1856, Nightingale wrote letters describing the spas of the Ottoman Empire and the health conditions, the physical descriptions, dietary information, and other vital details of patients. So she wanted to describe in detail so that people in the public could see what was actually going on. What were the health conditions of the Crimean War and of the Ottoman Empire? And in this case, some of the health conditions were actually really, really good. And she had adopted some of these ideas and she brought these forth in her letters. So she even detailed the lower cost, that it was lower in cost in the Ottoman Empire than it actually was in Switzerland during this time for the healthcare and the different means of taking care of her patients and stuff. So she had 45,000 pounds to set up her first nursing school at St. Thomas Hospital. And on May 16th, 1865, this was the first trained nurses that they began to work at the Liverpool Workhouse Infirmary. So she was able to fund, in this case, herself. And she was able to train these nurses to go and establish this Liverpool Workhouse Infirmary. It is now called the Florence Nightingale Faculty of Nursing and Midwifery, part of King College in London. In 1859, she wrote notes on nursing, the cornerstone curriculum, and she shared in this curriculum the sanitary knowledge she had, how to have no disease, how to recover from disease. So she wanted to get this knowledge into the minds of other women who wanted to become nurses, who wanted to follow that calling, to be able to make their society, their establishments a better place. In the Charles Dickens novel in 1843, 1844, Martin Chuzzlewit, the character who was along beside him called Sarah Gamp, was an example for the time before nurses. So servants or widows usually perform nursing. There was, like I said, all of this folklore and these superstitions and these herbal remedies, some being good, some being not so good. um, but it was usually up to the servants or the widows of the area to provide nursing. And sometimes they didn't always do everything right. Floors were usually laid with straw in the areas where they were doing nursing to soak up the blood that was happening. And it was a pretty gruesome sight most of the time. I've read stories of during the Civil War where soldiers would have legs, arms amputated, no, what was it they use? Like morphine or, things to help them, put them to sleep, to do a surgery. And many times it was gruesome. You would have piles of limbs setting off to the side. There was blood-soaked aprons that the doctors were wearing all the time. Didn't have maybe washing of hands back then. There was, like I said, no ventilation, no proper lighting probably during that time period. So you had a lot of problems that actually contributed to more disease than it did good. So Nightingale advocated for matrons to have full control over their staff, which challenged the doctors of the day. Many times, the doctors of the day were taking things that they had been taught in school. They were, contributing to the nursing that they did and never allowed the nurses to take part, to participate, to help. If someone came across with a now reformed idea, they would just kind of poo-poo it away. And many times they did more damage. They did more, or they made more problems than they actually solved, right? So she made sure that she advocated, look, these nurses I'm teaching, they need to have part in what you're doing in the doctoring. They need to be a part of the surgeries and the care of these patients because we're learning new things, and these new things are going to help you better doctor these people than was in the past. So in 1870, Linda Richards was mentored by Florence Nightingale, and she became America's first trained nurse. Um, be, she became the nursing pioneer in both the United States and Japan. And in 1873, Elizabeth Christophers Hobson co-founded the Bellevue Training School in New York after Nightingale plan, after the Nightingale way of doing things. So in my research, and there is so much more research. I mean, I could have probably taken 2 hours to do all of the research that I discovered on her. But she really was the pioneer of what we now have as nursing. And I think even in our day, we're still learning, right? We're still studying, we're still doing studies and labs, and there is a move back to herbal remedies in our day even. I am for herbal remedies over pharmaceutical in some cases. Let me give you an example. So, I've had pneumonia 3 times, and the third time that I had pneumonia, I went to the emergency room 3 times. And my husband has said that I actually should have sued this hospital because it was absolutely insane. I knew I had pneumonia because I'd had it twice before. I had already had it. And I told them I have pneumonia and I need to have this antibiotic to deal with this. They refused to listen to me. They would not listen. So the third time that I was in the emergency room, the doctor, who was the residing doctor at that time, walked in and he knew instantly I had pneumonia. He could see it. He understood my body language, and he was furious that they had not put me on antibiotic. In that case, I could have died if I hadn't had an antibiotic, right? So what I do now, because my lungs have been a little damaged from having pneumonia, I ended up having a nebulizer twice when I think I had the second bout of pneumonia. I had a nebulizer 2 times. In that case, I think the nebulizer did more damage to me than it did good. So my daughter, my youngest daughter, is actually into apothecary, which is herbal remedies, learning how to do different things, treat your body, do different remedies for your body, right? So I take each year a mullein tincture where I add the drops to my water, and that helps my lungs to keep my lungs healthy, to strengthen my lungs, to make sure that my antibodies are up so that I can fight off any chance of pneumonia. There have been other things, though, that we have treated with herbal remedies and has helped. So my youngest daughter is allergic to poison ivy. And the first time she did need an antibiotic because her body really exploded with the poison ivy. However, after that, we would help her by using jewel wheat. Now that's an orange plant. It has orange flowers on it. And you take those jewel wheat plants, you can put them in ice cubes and rub them on your skin. The oils of the jewel wheat on your skin will help take poison ivy away. And so there are many things that you can do to help your body when you are having an ailment. However, again, there are certain times when you absolutely need to have a pharmaceutical drug to help you. I do, however, think, though, that as a society, we have been overdone with antibiotics. We have been overstimulated with drugs. Nowadays, they have a drug for everything, and they want people on all kinds of drugs to treat all kinds of ailments, which over long periods of time cause huge side effects. COVID, for example, they wanted people to have the COVID vaccine, and now they are finding the COVID vaccine has done more damage than just having COVID itself. When they could have taken ivermectin, I believe the other one was like hydrochloroquine or something like that. And that has now been proven it would have taken the COVID away. So it depends on what the situation is, right? Whether you need a pharmaceutical or whether you can do an herbal remedy to help you. I am not all anti-vaccine. There are some vaccines you need. If you get tetanus, you can die from it. If you get certain things, you can die from it. However, I think we have been over-vaccinated as a society when if you would eat the right foods, and I don't do that 100%, but I do for the most part try to eat the right foods, drinking lots of water, getting exercise, getting fresh air, those things are important to building your health, right? To building up your immune system and things like that. When you over vaccinate yourself, when you're over putting antibodies or antibiotics into your body, you can cause more problems. And so in this situation of Florence Nightingale, many of the doctors who stuck to old ways of doing things ended up causing more problems than they solved. And Nightingale brought in a new approach, a new understanding of how things worked, not having sanitization, right? Having filthy floors and not washing your hands, right? When you're doing surgery, not wearing the proper clothing or a mask when you're doing your surgery, not having the operating room being sanitized before and after surgery. Those things are all new concepts, right? They've all come in within a certain time period, several decades. But learning how to do things differently didn't always set well with the doctors of the day during her time. But thankfully, she pressed through and she made it sure that we do have these new concepts. And she trained people, women, to be able to go and to do those things that she had learned so that nursing became a better thing and helped more people than it did damage, right? So we need that today. So she was quite an influential person. She didn't go according to the norms. She was a trendsetter. She kind of went against the tide of her day. And I'm so thankful for that because in my case, in several cases, I have been saved by medical things, right? I had scarlatina when I was 4 years old. I could have died from that. But through medicine, here I am today, right? I'm here. Taking an antibiotic when you have a severe case of pneumonia definitely saved my life. So there are some things that we do need medicine for. There are some things, however, that we can use herbal remedies for. And I highly recommend, please talk to your doctor before you do anything crazy. Don't just do the research and then go do something that could kill you or could make your situation even worse. So, there's a balance there. So in the case of Florence Nightingale, I'm so thankful for her that she did bring in some new reforms. She brought in some new ideas that made our society a better place. So anyway, thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you are on YouTube and you're watching me, thank you so much for watching this video. And if you're listening to my podcast, you can find them on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio. I'm pretty much all over the place. And thank you so much for supporting. And I will chat with you in the next episode, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye.